The gate slammed shut in front of me with a sharp, final click. Not an accident. A decision. On the other side stood my sister-in-law, Stephanie, surrounded by sleek patio furniture designer clothes, and the kind of guests she proudly called her inner circle. She glanced at my denim apron, the dirt on my hands, the basket of fresh basil I'd just picked from my garden, and said I was off-brand. 10 feet away, my husband Mason watched in silence. In that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't just an insult. It was the beginning of a shift none of them saw coming. For a few seconds, I just stood there staring at the gate. You know that strange moment after something humiliating happens, when your mind hasn't quite caught up yet. Your body understands first. Your chest tightens. Your stomach drops. But your thoughts are still trying to process what just happened. Stephanie didn't yell. She didn't insult me loudly. She simply looked at me. The apron, the dirt under my fingernails, the basket of basil, and decided I didn't belong in her world. Off-brand. The word lingered in the air long after she disappeared back toward her patio. And that word told me everything. Not we're out of space. Not maybe another night. Not even this is a private event. Off-brand. Like I wasn't a person. Like I was a mistake in the background of a carefully staged photograph. I slowly looked past the gate. Stephanie's patio looked exactly like her life, perfect, curated, and strangely lifeless. Gray slate tiles stretched across the ground. Gray wicker furniture arranged in clean geometric lines. Even the cushions were gray, like color itself had been edited out. Small groups of guests stood around with delicate plates of catered appetizers. Everything was perfectly arranged. Tiny tartlets, miniature quiches, polished glasses of wine, and yet the whole scene felt quiet. Too quiet. Not the relaxed quiet of people enjoying themselves. The stiff quiet of people performing for each other. Then my eyes found Mason. My husband was standing about 10 feet away, holding a glass of expensive wine. He had seen everything. He saw his sister close the gate in my face. He saw her look me up and down like I was something embarrassing. He heard her say I was off-brand, and he did nothing. He didn't step forward. He didn't call my name. He didn't even look uncomfortable. Instead, he took a slow sip of wine and turned his head to laugh at something one of the guests said. That silence hit harder than the gate. For years, I had told myself stories to make sense of this dynamic. Stephanie was difficult. Mason hated confrontation. Family dynamics were complicated. I repeated those explanations the way people repeat comforting lies. But standing there in the fading afternoon light, something finally snapped into focus. Mason wasn't keeping the peace. He was protecting his position. You see, in Stephanie's world, approval wasn't something freely given. It was something you earned, something you performed for, something you constantly chased, and Stephanie controlled it. She was the older sister, the successful one, the one who decided what counted as impressive and what didn't. Her approval was the sun. Everyone else just orbited around it, including Mason. He didn't challenge her because that would mean risking exile from her world. From the status, the connections, the image she had built. And tonight the price of staying in that orbit was me. I lowered my eyes to the basket in my hands. The basil leaves were bright green, still damp from the afternoon watering. When I shifted the basket slightly, the scent rose up. Fresh, peppery, alive, real. I glanced back at Stephanie's patio again. The air over there smelled faintly of expensive catering trays and car exhaust from the luxury vehicles lining the street. Everything looked polished. Everything looked perfect. But nothing about it felt alive. My side of the fence was different. Behind me stretched the garden I had built with my own hands. A vertical wall of herbs and ivy climbed along the fence. Tomato vines curled around wooden stakes. Clay pots overflowed with rosemary and thyme. The wooden table Mason and I built together 2 summers ago still carried small burn marks from late-night cooking experiments. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't minimalist. It wasn't curated for photographs. It was messy, warm, and full of life. And suddenly standing there between those 2 worlds, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. Stephanie's patio wasn't a home. It was a stage. The gray furniture, the catered food, the polished guests. It was all part of a performance, a brand, and apparently I had just been fired from the production. For a moment, I considered knocking on the gate, calling Mason's name, demanding an explanation. But then I pictured exactly how that would look from Stephanie's side of the fence. The emotional wife, the embarrassing scene, the disruption. And I realized something. They were expecting a reaction. They were expecting drama. What they weren't expecting was calm. So I didn't knock. I didn't call out. Instead, I turned around slowly and walked back toward the center of my yard, the basket of basil still in my hands. 5 quiet steps away from the gate, 5 steps away from their gray, carefully managed world. And with every step, the humiliation began to transform into something else. Not anger, something colder, something clearer. Because if Mason wanted to live on that side of the fence, in that colorless little orbit around his sister, then maybe it was time for me to stop trying to follow him there. I didn't go back to the gate. I didn't call Mason's name. Instead, I walked 5 slow steps into the center of my yard and set the basket of basil down on the old reclaimed wood table. Mason and I had built that table together 2 summers ago, back when he still talked about the future like we were building something together. For a moment, I just stood there. The sounds from Stephanie's patio floated faintly over the fence. Polite laughter, the clink of wine glasses, the low hum of networking conversations. Everything controlled, everything curated. Then I turned toward the corner of the yard. The pizza oven stood there quietly, like it always did. It wasn't sleek or minimalist like the things Stephanie liked. It was heavy stone shaped in a wide dome, its surface covered in a mosaic of broken tiles I'd scavenged from renovation sites around the neighborhood. Blues, reds, bits of old ceramic patterns that didn't match, but somehow worked together anyway. It looked a little wild, a little imperfect, but it was mine. I walked over to the woodpile and crouched down, running my hand across the stack until I found what I wanted. 3 solid pieces of seasoned oak. Dry dense, the kind of wood that burns hot and steady. I carried them to the oven and set them inside the fire chamber. A handful of kindling, a twist of newspaper. Then I struck a match. For a second, the flame flickered, weakly, trembling in the breeze. Then the kindling caught the fire, licking upward with a bright orange flash. Within seconds, the oak began to burn. A soft crackle filled the air. Smoke curled out of the oven's mouth and drifted upward, carrying that unmistakable scent of real wood fire, earthy, warm, almost sweet. Technically, I was just making dinner, but standing there feeding that fire, it felt like something more. Not revenge, not a performance, a declaration. Because on the other side of the fence, everything was gray. Gray tiles, gray furniture, gray delicate little appetizers sitting untouched on white plates. My side of the fence was waking up. The fire popped loudly as the oak split open in the heat. Warmth spread outward, pushing back the evening chill that had started to creep into the air. I dusted the wooden pizza peel with flour and walked to the vertical garden wall along the fence. The herbs climbed up in thick green layers. Basil, oregano, thyme, trailing ivy weaving through it all. When I reached for the basil leaves and snapped them free, the smell burst into the air instantly. Sharp, peppery, alive. I tore a handful more and carried them back to the table. Inside the kitchen, the dough had already been waiting. I'd started it 2 days earlier like I always did. Slow fermented 48 hours in the fridge until the yeast had time to work its quiet magic. When I lifted the lid from the bowl, the dough had that perfect airy stretch, soft and elastic in my hands. I pressed it gently onto the floured surface. The rhythmic motion of my hands began to take over. Stretch, turn, press. Stretch, turn, press. The kind of movement you don't have to think about once you've done it 1,000 times. As the oven heated behind me, the smells of flour, basil, and wood smoke began mixing together in the air. And that was when I noticed something. The smoke didn't rise straight up. It drifted right over the fence, right toward Stephanie's perfect little gathering. I glanced through the gaps in the ivy climbing along the fence line. From here I could see the edge of the patio, guests standing with their delicate plates, conversations happening in careful little clusters. For a while no one noticed. Then one of them paused. Another turned their head slightly. The scent of oak fire travels fast, and the smell of fresh dough hitting hot stone travels even faster. I slid the first pizza into the oven. The crust began to bubble almost immediately, the edges rising and blistering in the heat. Tomato sauce darkened. Mozzarella softened into glossy white pools. The fire cracked again behind it. Smoke curled upward and slipped quietly over the fence. I didn't look back toward the gate. I didn't need to, because the message wasn't meant to be shouted. It was meant to be smelled. The first person to appear at the fence wasn't one of Stephanie's guests. It was Mrs. Patricia. Now, if you lived anywhere near our block, you knew the name, but you didn't really know the woman. She lived in the end unit, the strange, sprawling townhouse half hidden behind thick wisteria vines that climbed the walls like they owned the place. Rumors said she had more money than most of the investors Stephanie liked to brag about, and even less patience. She almost never spoke to anyone, but she watched everything. That night, her silver head slowly rose above the line of my vertical garden like a curious hawk peeking over a ridge. She didn't greet me. She didn't smile. Instead, she leaned forward and sniffed the air. "Is that oak?" she barked. Her voice was rough like gravel sliding across stone. I looked up from the dough, slightly startled. "Yes, ma'am," I said. "Seasoned oak." Her sharp eyes moved immediately past me to the oven, where the fire glowed bright inside the stone dome. Then her gaze dropped to the pizza I was sliding onto the hot surface. "And that basil," she said, pointing a long finger toward the leaves scattered across the dough. "Did you grow it?" There was something about the way she asked that made me stand a little straighter. "I did," I said. "From seed." Genovese basil. My grandmother used to grow the same variety. Mrs. Patricia didn't respond right away. She just stood there staring at me, her expression impossible to read. Then her eyes shifted past my shoulder. Through the ivy gaps in the fence, you could clearly see Stephanie's patio. Even from here, the contrast was almost funny. On that side, guests stood in stiff little clusters, balancing delicate plates of tiny catered bites. The lighting was harsh and bright, clearly designed for photos more than comfort. The laughter drifting across the fence sounded careful, polite, like everyone was making sure they laughed at the correct volume. On my side, the fire popped loudly inside the oven. The smell of baking crust and melting cheese drifted through the garden. Basil leaves were scattered across the table. A bag of flour had tipped over slightly, leaving a soft white cloud across the wood surface. It was messy, but it was alive. Mrs. Patricia looked back at me slowly. My grandmother grew basil in Queens. She said, her voice suddenly softer, in a dented pot on a fire escape. Only green thing we saw all summer. I smiled. She must have been proud of it. She guarded it like treasure, Mrs. Patricia muttered. Then something unexpected happened. She didn't ask if she could come over. She simply turned, walked to the small gate between our yards, unlatched it, and stepped through. Just like that. She was wearing a silk kimono that looked like it had been borrowed from a museum and slippers that probably cost more than my car. The combination would have looked ridiculous on anyone else. On her, it somehow looked perfectly natural. She walked straight to the table, pulled out one of the mismatched garden chairs, and sat down like she had been invited hours ago. Then she folded her hands and waited. No explanation, no small talk, just quiet expectation. I slid the first finished pizza onto the peel and placed it on the cutting board in front of her. The crust crackled softly as it cooled. Mrs. Patricia tore off a piece with her fingers and took a bite. Her eyes closed. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then she nodded once slowly. Finally, she muttered, and that was when the back door opened. Haley came skipping out onto the patio. My daughter was 10 years old, right at that age where the world starts telling kids to be embarrassed by everything. But Haley had never seemed to get that memo. Her eyes immediately locked onto the oven. "Are we making pizza?" she asked. "Always," I said. She ran straight to the outdoor sink, washed her hands quickly, then grabbed a fresh ball of dough like she had done it 100 times before. "Can I do the pepperoni?" she asked. "You can do whatever you want," I told her. "It's your kitchen." Haley grinned and started arranging toppings with serious concentration. Mrs. Patricia watched the whole thing quietly, occasionally stealing another piece of crust from the board. Soon the rhythm settled in. I stretched the dough. Haley layered toppings with the careful precision of a tiny artist. The oven roared softly, flames curling against the stone. And every few minutes another pizza slid inside. On the other side of the fence, Stephanie's networking party continued exactly as planned. Perfect, organized, controlled. But here in the garden, the night was beginning to feel like something completely different. Not an event, not a performance, a gathering. And judging by the way the smell of pizza kept drifting over that fence, it wouldn't stay small for long. The smell was the first thing that crossed the fence. Not the smoke, not the laughter, the smell. Anyone who's ever stood near a real wood-fired oven knows that scent. It's impossible to ignore. The moment dough hits hot stone, the air fills with something warm and deep, yeasty bread, blistering crust, sweet tomatoes, melted cheese basil just beginning to wilt under the heat. It doesn't stay in one place. It travels. And that night, the breeze carried it straight over Stephanie's perfectly arranged patio. At first, nothing changed. Her guests kept standing in their neat little clusters, holding their tiny white plates with the kind of delicate appetizers you're supposed to admire more than eat. Little tartlets, mini quiches, carefully arranged bites that looked impressive, but didn't smell like much of anything. Then I noticed the first pause. A man near the edge of the patio stopped mid-sentence. His head tilted slightly, like his nose had caught something interesting. A woman beside him sniffed the air without realizing she was doing it. Their conversation continued, but their attention had shifted. A minute later, someone else turned. Through the gaps in the ivy climbing the fence, I could see them now. Guests glancing subtly toward the rising smoke from my oven, toward the flicker of firelight bouncing off the leaves of the garden wall. The difference between the two spaces had become impossible to miss. Stephanie's patio looked like a catalog photo. Gray slate tiles, gray wicker furniture, soft white lighting positioned perfectly for photographs. Everything arranged with precision, but the atmosphere felt thin. The laughter was polite, controlled. The kind people use when they're trying to sound impressed. My side of the fence was something else entirely. The fire popped loudly as another piece of oak split open. A spray of sparks flickered briefly in the oven's mouth before disappearing again. Haley laughed at something Mrs. Patricia said, one of those big full-body laughs kids have before they learn to hold themselves back. Flower dust floated through the warm air like tiny clouds. The garden lights hanging between the trees swayed slightly in the breeze, casting soft gold circles across the table and the rows of herbs climbing the fence. And the pizzas just kept coming. Every few minutes, the peel slid into the oven. Every few minutes, another bubbling crust emerged, blistered and golden. The scent kept building. Bread, cheese, basil, wood smoke. You could practically see it drifting over the fence like an invisible invitation. Across the yard, more heads were turning now. A young couple near the far end of Stephanie's patio looked down at the small appetizers on their plates. Then they looked toward the fence, then back at their plates. I watched the woman quietly set hers down on the edge of a table. No drama, no announcement, just a quiet little decision. That's when something clicked for me. I had started the fire just to make dinner. That was the truth. But somewhere along the way, the garden had turned into something else. People weren't just smelling food. They were sensing life. On Stephanie's patio, everything was about presentation, about image, about showing the right people the right version of yourself. It was networking, brand building, performance. Over here, none of that mattered. Mrs. Patricia was tearing crust apart with her fingers like she hadn't eaten all day. Haley was carefully arranging pepperoni slices in perfect spirals. I was dusted in flower aprons, stained with sauce hair falling loose around my face. No one looked impressive, but everyone looked comfortable. And as the smell of fresh pizza kept rolling across that fence, I realized something. Stephanie wasn't hosting a gathering. She was hosting a showroom. What was happening in my yard was something entirely different. It was messy. It was loud. It was warm. And without planning it, without announcing it, without sending out invitations, the garden had become something rare. A place people actually wanted to be. For a while, Stephanie tried to pretend nothing was happening. You could almost see the effort in the way she kept smiling too brightly, the way she leaned into conversations just a little too hard, as if enthusiasm alone could drown out the crackle of my oven and the laughter drifting over the fence. But there's only so long someone can ignore the smell of fresh pizza. Eventually, her patience snapped. It didn't begin with shouting. Stephanie never shouted first. She performed. "It smells like burning fat," she announced, suddenly her voice carrying clearly across the patio. She wasn't talking to anyone in particular. The words were aimed at the whole crowd. She wrinkled her nose delicately and waved a manicured hand in front of her face as if the air itself had become offensive. "Mason, darling," she said sweetly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Could you go check? I think the neighbors are burning garbage again." The neighbors, not Alexis, not your wife. The neighbors. I could feel Mrs. Patricia's eyebrow rise from across the table, but she didn't say anything yet. Haley kept arranging pepperoni slices like none of it mattered. A moment later, I heard the gate latch on Stephanie's side click. Footsteps approached the fence. Mason appeared through the ivy gaps, his tie loosened slightly. Now his forehead shining faintly under the patio lights. He looked tired, like someone who had been holding tension in his shoulders all evening. "Alexis," he said quietly. I slid a pizza deeper into the oven before turning toward him. "Yeah." He rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding my eyes. "Steph says the smoke is bothering the guests." I glanced up at the clean plume drifting lazily from the oven. "It's oak mason," I said. "It smells like a campfire." I know, he said quickly. "But could you maybe put it out?" The words landed softly, but they still stung. "Put it out. Just for tonight," he added. "It's important." Behind him, Stephanie stood, with her arms folded, pretending not to watch, but very clearly watching. I leaned the pizza peel against the table and crossed my arms. "Important how?" Mason hesitated. Then he lowered his voice. "That guy over there," he said, tilting his head slightly toward the patio. "The one in the blue suit. That's Marcus Thorne." The name didn't mean much to me at first. Food critic Mason added quickly. I followed his glance. Sure enough, a tall man in a sharp blue suit stood near the edge of the patio. He looked bored. He was holding one of Stephanie's delicate little appetizers like it might bite him. "Steph's trying to get him to feature her design firm in his lifestyle column," Mason continued. "This is a big deal." I looked back at Mason, then at the oven, then at the pizza bubbling inside it. "If she wants to impress a food critic," I said calmly, "maybe she should have served him hot food." Mason's jaw tightened. "Alexis?" "Seriously," I said, "cold tartlets and warm white wine. That's the strategy." His voice dropped to a strained whisper. "Just put the fire out, please, for me." For a second, the old instinct flickered inside me, the one that always told me to smooth things over, to keep the peace, to make things easier. But then I thought about the gate slamming in my face, about the word off-brand, about the way Mason had taken a sip of wine and laughed while it happened. And something inside me finally settled. "No," I said. The word came out calm, simple. Mason blinked like he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. "No," he repeated. "For you," I said slowly, "I've done a lot of things over the years." I gestured toward the fire, the table, the garden. "But I'm not making myself smaller, so your sister can feel bigger." The sentence hung there between us. For the first time all evening, Mason looked directly at me. Really looked like he was seeing someone unfamiliar standing in his yard. "You're serious," he said quietly. "Very." Behind him, Stephanie's heels suddenly clicked across the slate patio. "Oh, forget it, Mason," she snapped. Striding toward the fence, she stopped beside him and glared across the ivy wall. But she didn't address me. Of course she didn't. Instead, she turned back toward her guests and raised her voice. "So sorry, everyone," she said brightly. "It's just a little rustic next door." A few guests shifted awkwardly. Stephanie gestured vaguely toward my yard without looking directly at it. "Some people," she continued, her smile tightening, "don't really understand neighborhood standards about sanitation and open fires." She pulled out her phone. The flash burst suddenly in the twilight. For a moment I was blinded. When my vision cleared, Stephanie was holding her phone up proudly, posting this to the neighborhood watch group. She said cheerfully, caption, "When the neighborhood eyesore ruins your evening." The patio went quiet, and across the table, Mrs. Patricia slowly set down her slice of pizza. The flash from Stephanie's phone faded, leaving a strange stillness behind it. For a second, nobody spoke. Then Stephanie lifted her chin slightly, the way she always did when she believed she had the upper hand. "This is ridiculous," she said sharply. Her voice had lost that cheerful performance tone now. What replaced it was colder, tighter. She tapped her phone screen again, her thumb hovering over something, like it was a weapon she was about to fire. "I'm calling the HOA president," she announced. "And the city." A ripple of murmurs moved through the guests behind her. "Running an unlicensed restaurant in a residential zone is illegal." She continued, her eyes locking onto mine for the first time all evening. "Alexis, you know that?" She held the phone up slightly, almost like she expected applause. "Shut it down now," she said, or I reported. The words hung there heavy and metallic. Behind her, a few guests shifted, awkwardly. Mason looked at me again, the same quiet plea in his eyes. "Just stop. Just make it easier." But something had changed tonight. I wiped my hands slowly on my apron and walked toward the fence. The fire crackled behind me. The smell of baking dough still filled the garden. When I reached the ivy-covered boards, I rested my hands lightly on the top. "Go ahead," I said. My voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The sudden quiet carried it across the yard perfectly. Stephanie blinked. "Excuse me?" "Call them," I repeated calmly. Her expression flickered with confusion. I continued before she could recover. "I know the codes, Stephanie." That seemed to surprise her more than anything. I checked them before I laid the first brick of that oven. A few guests leaned slightly closer now. Curiosity had replaced the polite boredom that had been hanging over the patio all evening. "This is a private residence," I said. "I'm not charging anyone money. I'm not advertising anything." I gestured behind me toward the table where Mrs. Patricia sat comfortably finishing another slice. "I'm feeding my family and my neighbors." I nodded toward Haley, toward the couple who had slowly wandered closer to the fence after smelling the pizza. "This is a dinner party," I said, "just like yours." Stephanie's eyes narrowed, except I added calmly, "Mine doesn't violate zoning laws." Now the silence deepened. "What are you talking about?" she snapped. I tilted my head slightly toward the patio. "Your event planner?" I said, pointing toward the woman in black, standing stiffly near the catering trays. The woman froze. "Your paid catering staff." Another uncomfortable shift passed through the guests. And the little detail about ticketed entry, I continued. Stephanie's face lost a shade of color. "You mentioned it in the invitation," I said, "that donations were required at the door for your charity fundraiser." A few guests glanced at each other now, some clearly hearing this detail for the first time. "You're using a residential property for a commercial gathering," I finished calmly. "Paid staff, paid entry, business promotion." Stephanie's hand tightened around her phone. "Technically," I said, letting the words settle slowly, "you're the one running an unlicensed commercial event." No one moved. No one spoke. The patio light suddenly felt very bright. "And if you call the city," I continued, "I'd be happy to show them the invitation you sent out." Stephanie stared at me. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. She looked toward Marcus Thorne, who had turned fully, now his interest clearly awakened. Then she looked back at her guests. Several of them were now examining the ground, their wine glasses, their phones, anywhere but her face. "You wouldn't," she whispered. "I would," I said simply. Her phone slowly lowered. "You wanted to talk about rules," I added quietly. "So, let's talk about them." The humiliation spread across her face in slow motion. For the first time all evening, Stephanie looked unsure. Her perfect narrative had cracked, and suddenly, in front of the very audience she had worked so hard to impress, she wasn't the one in control anymore. The silence after Stephanie lowered her phone felt thick enough to touch. No one spoke. Then a quiet sound broke the tension. A soft clearing of a throat. Everyone turned. Marcus Thorne, the man in the sharp blue suit, had stepped closer to the edge of the patio. Until now, he had looked like someone counting the minutes until he could politely leave. One hand still held a tiny catered tartlet untouched, but his attention had shifted completely. Not to Stephanie, to the fence. More specifically, to the oven. He leaned slightly forward, sniffing the air the way people do when they catch a smell they can't quite believe. Then he spoke. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm and unexpectedly warm. His eyes landed on me. "Is that sourdough?" For a second, nobody moved. Stephanie blinked rapidly. "Yes," I said. "Cold fermented. 48 hours. Something lit up in his expression. Without another word, Marcus set the untouched tartlet down on the nearest table. He straightened his jacket. Then, before anyone quite realized what was happening, he walked straight toward the fence. Gasps rippled through Stephanie's guests. Marcus placed one hand on the top rail and climbed over, not awkwardly, not hesitantly. For a man wearing an expensive suit, he moved with surprising ease. One leg over, then the other, landing lightly on the mulch path in my garden. Stephanie looked like someone had unplugged her. "Marcus," she started. He didn't even turn around. Instead, he walked straight to the table where the latest pizza rested, steam curling gently from the blistered crust. Mrs. Patricia lifted an eyebrow but said nothing. Marcus looked at me politely. "May I?" I handed him the pizza peel. "Be my guest." He lifted a slice carefully, the melted cheese stretching for a moment before snapping clean. Then he took a bite and closed his eyes. The entire yard seemed to pause with him. For a moment, the only sound was the quiet crackle of the oven behind us. Then Marcus exhaled slowly. "My God," he murmured. His eyes opened again bright now. "The fermentation on this dough," he said almost to himself. "It's perfect." 48 hours, I said again. "San Marzano tomatoes?" he asked. I nodded. "And oak fire?" "Yes." Marcus shook his head slightly, smiling now. "This is brilliant." Across the fence, you could practically feel the shift happening. The guests on Stephanie's patio were no longer pretending to enjoy their tiny appetizers. They were watching the famous food critics stand in my garden eating pizza with the kind of quiet concentration people reserve for things that actually matter. Mrs. Patricia slid a mason jar toward him. "Wine," she offered. He glanced at the jar. "What is it?" "Boxed red," she said. "But it hasn't been sitting in the sun for 3 hours." Marcus laughed softly and accepted it. On the other side of the fence, the dam finally cracked. The young couple I'd noticed earlier approached the gate slowly. The woman peeked through the ivy. Is it okay if we join?" she asked. I gestured toward the open space around the table. "Everyone's welcome." That was all it took. The gate creaked open. They stepped through. Then another pair of guests moved closer. Then another. Within minutes, people were leaving the gray patio behind, crossing the fence one by one, like travelers discovering a hidden path. They sat wherever they could on garden chairs, overturned buckets, even the low retaining wall near the tomato beds. Haley started handing out slices as fast as I could bake them. The air filled with chatter, laughter, and the clink of mason jars. And across the fence, Stephanie stood frozen in the center of her perfect, empty patio, watching her party disappear into my garden. While the garden filled with laughter and the steady rhythm of pizzas coming out of the oven, something else was happening on the other side of the fence. Mason hadn't crossed over yet. He was still standing near the catering table on Stephanie's patio, almost forgotten in the chaos of guests drifting away. For a moment, he just stood there watching people leave. Watching Marcus Thorne laugh with Haley while balancing a slice of pizza in a mason jar of boxed wine. Then something on the ground caught his eye. A thick piece of paper had slipped out of Stephanie's clutch during all the commotion. It lay on the gray slate tiles like a pale flag against the stone. Mason bent down and picked it up. At first he looked mildly confused. Then he started reading, and the color slowly drained from his face. "Steph," he said. His voice sounded strange, then hollow. Stephanie whipped around from where she had been glaring at the fence, which she snapped. "What is it now?" Mason held up the paper, staring at it like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "This isn't an invoice for the event planner." Stephanie lunged forward. "Give me that." He stepped back, just enough to keep it out of reach. "It's a final notice from a collections agency," he said slowly. The garden went quiet. Even the chatter around the table softened as people started to realize something serious was unfolding. Mason flipped the page, his eyes scanning faster now. "You're 3 months behind on the lease for your office," he continued, disbelief creeping into his voice. Stephanie's face had gone pale under the patio lights. "That's none of your business," she hissed. "There's another one," Mason said, pulling a second paper from the stack that had fallen out of her bag. He read it quickly. "Credit card debt, $50,000. A murmur rippled through the remaining guests. Mason looked up at her, stunned. "Steph, you told me your firm was having its best quarter ever." "It is," she snapped immediately, her voice sharp with panic. "It's an investment. You have to spend money to make money." Mason's expression hardened. "You told me you needed that loan from our joint savings for expansion." Stephanie's mouth opened, then closed. "You took money from our family account," he continued, slowly the realization hitting him, piece by piece. "From Haley's college fund." His voice rose, the disbelief turning into something heavier. "For this?" He gestured around the patio, the abandoned catering trays, the rented furniture, the decorative lights, the empty clusters where guests had been standing just minutes ago. "For a party." Stephanie's composure finally cracked. "I did it for the family brand," she shouted. The words echoed awkwardly across the now half-empty patio. Mason stared at her, like he was seeing her for the first time. "No," he said quietly. "You did it for you." His eyes swept across the empty space where her carefully curated audience had once stood. "Because you're terrified that if you stop pretending to be rich," he continued, "people will realize there's nothing behind it." The silence that followed was absolute. Stephanie's glamorous world, the image, the confidence, the perfect brand collapsed in a single moment. And suddenly, under the bright patio lights, she didn't look powerful at all. She looked exposed. The room was still buzzing from Mason's discovery when Mrs. Patricia stepped forward. Her posture, once quiet and unassuming, now carried a quiet authority that gradually silenced the murmurs. "Before this goes any further," she said calmly, "there's something I should clarify." Stephanie, pale and shaken, tried to interrupt. "Mrs. Patricia, this really isn't." "Oh, but it is," the older woman replied, her voice steady. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a thin folder, placing it on the table with deliberate care. "My name is not simply Mrs. Patricia," she continued. "My full name, is Patricia Sterling. A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd. I am the owner of this property block, she explained, gesturing toward the walls of the elegant townhouse. Every building on this street operates under my management company. Stephanie's expression froze. For the past 6 months, Patricia continued opening the folder. This townhouse has been in violation of its residential lease agreement. The contract explicitly prohibits commercial use, particularly ticketed social events. Several guests exchanged glances. Furthermore, Patricia said lifting a document rent payments have not been made for 3 consecutive months. Stephanie's voice trembled. There must be some mistake. There isn't. Patricia slid a paper across the table. It has also come to my attention that tonight's event was organized as a paid gathering, which is a direct breach of the lease terms. The room had gone completely silent. Patricia met Stephanie's eyes, her tone firm, but not cruel. Stephanie, I gave you multiple written notices and opportunities to resolve this situation. You ignored every one of them. She pushed the final document forward. This is a formal eviction notice. You have 30 days to vacate the property. Stephanie stared at the paper as if it might disappear. The elegant facade she had carefully built all evening wealth success control crumbled in a matter of seconds. Around the room, guests no longer looked impressed. They looked uncomfortable. And the illusion Stephanie had tried so desperately to maintain was finally gone. A few weeks after Stephanie moved out, the tall fence between the yards quietly came down. In its place, the garden opened into one shared space where neighbors now gather every Sunday, pizza baking in the oven, stories passing across the table and laughter filling the air. Mason slowly found his way back to family, often tending the oven beside us. Funny how rejection can build something better. Sometimes the best answer is simply building a table where everyone belongs. If this story meant something to you, consider liking, subscribing, and sharing your own experience too.